questions and all the best. Then we'll continue. We're a little bit behind schedule now. Our last speaker in this session is Mrs. Machon. I hope I got it right now, from former MI5 official.
Thank you very much for inviting me to make a statement to this committee. I'm going to be talking a bit about the UK setup, the intelligence world, and the legal regulations and restrictions, and also around what happens to whistleblowers coming out of UK intelligence. I then have a few recommendations which I would respectfully like to put in front of the committee, which I would hope would generate a little more discussion later on this afternoon. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the UK intelligence setup, our agencies have been around much longer than the US. They're just over 100 years old now, and for the first 80 years of their existence, they didn't officially exist. Our members of parliament were not allowed to ask questions to find out what they were doing. And a law was put in place soon after their inception in 1911, the very first Official Secrets Act, which was there to try and prevent the leaking and betrayal of national security secrets to our enemy powers. If you were found guilty under this law, you were a traitor and you received 14 years in prison, and this law is still in place. However, after their 80 years of, as the 80s spycatcher novelist, writer Peter Wright once said, bugging and burgling their way around London with impunity, in the 1980s there were a series of whistleblowing scandals, and as a result of this, some more laws were put in place, which were key to the later development of what I want to talk about today. First of all, the Official Secrets Act was updated. Because of the whistleblowing scandals in the 1980s, they stripped out what had existed before, which was if someone blew the whistle, they could exercise a public interest defence. This was removed from the '89 Act, and what was put in place is what the lawyers call a clear, bright line against disclosure, which means that if you are a former or serving intelligence officer, you automatically break the law if you talk about your work to anyone outside the agency for which you work. However, at the same time, in 1989, they set up the Security Service Act to regulate the work of MI5 to a more democratic degree. And then in 1994, MI6, the International Intelligence Gathering Agency, and our listening post at GCHQ were also put on a legal footing with the 1994 Intelligence Services Act. And this act was key as well because for the very first time, it set in place a committee in Parliament which was supposedly to have some sort of notional oversight of the work of the intelligence agencies. However, until this year, that committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee, has been toothless because it was only able to investigate policy, finance and administration. And as other scandals have unfolded in the last 20 years, they were unable to call for witnesses from the intelligence agencies, subpoena them, demand access to documents, or to investigate allegations of crime. So that's the current framework in the UK, and it's ironic, I find it somewhat ironic to be discussing the UK now, as of course they are very much the partners in crime, apparently, looking at the current NSA revelations from Edward Snowden. So I worked for MI5 in the 1990s, and this is why it was crucial to have all these new laws put in place when I joined, because it was probably the most ethical era of MI5's 100-year existence. Suddenly they're on a legal footing for the first time, and this is before the tragic events of 9/11, when the intelligence gloves came off. And yet, despite that, I and my former partner, a man called David Shaler, saw so many things going wrong in the 6 years we worked for MI5 that we felt compelled to resign and compelled to blow the whistle. We had raised our concerns on the inside, as had many of our peer group, who were all resigning in record numbers around the same time. And yet we were told to shut up, not rock the boat, and just follow orders. There was no effective avenue for ventilation outside the intelligence agencies. So David Shaler and I helped him, decided to blow the whistle on a whole series of crimes that we saw being committed. And these sort of escalated over our years in MI5, starting with files on our government ministers. The very people who are supposed to hold the spies to account had secret information held on them by the spies. There were illegal phone taps of left-wing journalists, innocent people put in prison when MI5 had information that indicated they could be innocent, but they withheld it from the trial. IRA bombs that could and should have been prevented going off on UK streets, and then MI5 lying to government to cover up its mistakes. And most crucially for us, this was the case that made us quit, was MI6's involvement in funding a terrorist operation in Libya to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi in 1996. This went wrong. It was illegal under UK law, and innocent people were killed. We could not think of a more heinous act to have witnessed, and this is why we decided to resign and blow the whistle. And we knew we faced prosecution under the 1989 Official Secrets Act by going public. So we went literally on the run, a bit like Edward Snowden. And we had to live in hiding in France for a year, and then live in exile in France for another 2 years, because MI5 was trying to prosecute us. David, in fact, was prosecuted. He went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the UK failed to extradite him from France to stand trial under the Official Secrets Act in 1988. And then, secondly, after he had returned to the UK voluntarily to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act, and he was found guilty in 2002. So it was a very frightening experience to go through, and of course we had to give up our jobs, our career prospects, our very way of life, and of course risk prison. And it wasn't just us who did that. David, as I said, went to prison. I was arrested, but his brother was arrested. His 2 best friends were arrested. Journalists were arrested and threatened with prosecution around this case for daring to expose the crimes of the spies. It was also a salutary lesson to us as well for what it's like to live under a state of constant possible surveillance, where you can't feel that you can have a private telephone conversation or send private emails, where you can't feel that you can have a private conversation in the privacy of your own home, even your bedroom, and also potentially where your friends may be pressured to report on you. And that's what it would be like to live under a Stasi-type state, and that's how we felt we had to live for a number of years. What was also interesting around the case was looking at how the media, who notionally should be able to hold the spies to account, could also be legally controlled. There is a raft of legislation in the UK that can be used to threaten the media, and is indeed being used at the moment to stifle media debate about the Edward Snowden case. These include injunctions, super injunctions where you can't even discuss there is an injunction. There are public interest immunity certificates that the government can use, which are like injunctions. They used the Terrorism Act to threaten journalists. They also have a voluntary system called the D-Notice Committee, and a D-Notice has been issued to stifle legitimate debate within our mainstream media about Edward Snowden. Finally, of course, it's not just the whistleblower in UK law who faces prosecution. Also, our journalists can be prosecuted under Section 5 of the 1989 Whistleblowers Act if they cause damage to national security by reporting the stories given to them by the whistleblowers. This is more draconian even than in Russia today. So it's a bit of a mess in the UK. There is notional oversight provision. For example, we do have the ISC, Intelligence and Security Committee, which I mentioned, but they have been largely toothless. And also many stories have emerged over the last decade to show that senior spies have admitted to getting away with lying to that committee, because they can, because the committee has no way of forcing the issue. The idea there is some notional democratic oversight. For example, if MI5 wants to bug our communications, then theoretically they have to get a Home Office warrant signed off by the minister who's their boss. Unfortunately, the politician only gets to see a summary of a summary of a summary of a summary of the intelligence case, and it's very easy for the spies to big up that intelligence case and ensure that they get the permission required. They can also go for what are called omnibus warrants, and that is what I think we're seeing, for example, with the GCHQ use of the tempora surveillance technique, which William Hague, our current Foreign Secretary, said of course was legal, of course there was oversight under the ISA. But in fact, this seems to be in nebulous legal ground, because if this is an omnibus warrant covering millions or billions of communications, then one warrant being signed off every 6 months automatically is not efficient oversight. So, why is whistleblowing important in the UK? We don't have a written constitution. This is one of the issues that came up before. We don't have a written constitution, and we have effectively the least accountable and most legally protected of all intelligence communities in the Western world. And because of this incredibly closed mindset, we get a sort of groupthink building up on the inside. If you're told not to rock the boat, told not to question ethical decisions, then those who do have ethical qualms often resign, and those who don't stay and get promoted. And I think this is what we've seen, for example, with the allegations of MI5 and MI6 being involved in torture cases over the last decade, since 9/11. In the 1990s, the spies did not use torture. It was unethical and it was ineffectual and it created blowback. And they'd learnt this lesson the hard way in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. However, suddenly after 9/11, they seem to have forgotten those lessons, and perhaps this sort of closed mindset, this groupthink, self-perpetuating oligarchy and lack of ventilation allow them to take that moral slide down towards involvement in torture again. So whistleblowers can add, or ventilation can add, a very powerful check to that sort of dangerous moral slide, in my opinion. There's also, of course, a war on whistleblowers going on, particularly in the US, where I think Obama has used the Espionage Act more times to try and persecute whistleblowers in his brief presidency than all other presidents since 1917 combined. This is nothing if not a war on whistleblowers, and yet it contrasts, in my mind, very starkly with the treatment meted out to real spies. You'll probably remember the Russian spy ring, the illegals who were caught in America in 2010. And yet a deal was done and they were handed over to Russia with no prosecution under this Espionage Act, which is wheeled out time and again to persecute whistleblowers, legitimate whistleblowers in the US. And I think this hypocrisy is breathtaking. And I think we need whistleblowers now. With this encroaching surveillance state, with this global surveillance dystopia that is gradually emerging from the Snowden revelations, and also, of course, with the spread of other questionable activities around the world, things like CIA kill lists, the assassination of terrorist suspects without due process by the use of drones, the invasion of sovereign countries on dubious intelligence, which in the past, for example, with the invasion of Iraq, has been proven to have been based on lies. All these things cry out for the need for greater accountability and greater transparency. And it's only by having those two key aspects can we hope for greater justice. So what would be some recommendations I would like to throw into the process, to throw into the debate, because we're looking at the legal protection of whistleblowers. And one thing, particularly in the UK, I would suggest, is that we need meaningful parliamentary oversight, real parliamentary oversight. We need a parliamentary committee which is elected by Parliament, not appointed by the Prime Minister, which has full, wide-ranging legal powers to take the evidence of whistleblowers, to allow them a legal channel to go to, so they don't have to turn their lives inside out by exposing crimes of the spies. We also need the fact that this committee in Parliament would be trusted by the whistleblowers to carry out a real and effective investigation into any allegations of malfeasance by the spies. And this would include a full inquiry conducted, evidence gathered and taken from all sides, reforms applied, and indeed crimes, if they are found to have been committed, to be punished. At this stage, it's very easy for the spies and the spy masters to cover up and lie when they're caught out doing something wrong. I would also suggest that certainly in the UK, we need a legal definition of what constitutes national security, because we don't currently have that under the law. And much is made of, we need to protect national security, and often the spies will conflate that with the national interest, which is not a reason to shut up whistleblowers and impede their freedom of expression under Article 10.2 of the European Convention of Human Rights. So we need a proper legal definition and an understanding as well that to protect national security means that you have to protect the integrity and the future existence of your nation state. So the odd bomb going off on the streets is traumatizing and terrible, but it does not threaten the national integrity of the state. Some other quick suggestions. One would be, of course, there was some very good evidence put in by Duncan Campbell about the echelon report from 10 years ago. That needs, in my view, to be revisited. It was a perfect opportunity for Europe to build its own key communications infrastructure, to break away from the American hegemony, and also to provide protection for its citizens, and also to try and ensure that the US complies with the European Convention on Human Rights and our standards within our communities and countries. Finally, and just quickly to conclude, we need technology policies that allow us to protect ourselves if our states won't do that for us. So, for example, if we are unable to protect ourselves on the communications network, what we can do is take steps as individual citizens to protect ourselves, take our own steps, move away from the US proprietary closed corporate software systems and develop our own, because it would be good for our EU economy too. And finally, why do we all do this as whistleblowers? Just to finish, we need free media, we need a free internet, because if we don't have that, if we can't read and write and listen and discuss ideas freely and in privacy, we are indeed living in an Orwellian dystopia, and we're all potentially at risk. The central societal function of privacy in our communications is not just so that we can chat away to each other with nobody eavesdropping, although it's very corrosive to feel that you are being surveyed and listened to all the time, as I've experienced personally myself. But privacy, private communications, is the bedrock and defense against encroaching surveillance states and potentially encroaching extremist states. And as we've seen, for example, the rise of Golden Dawn in Greece, who can say where our political systems will take us in future? And this is why we need to protect and ensure our privacy now. So just as a final comment, I would suggest that there is no balance between privacy and security, is the argument that the spies and the intelligence agencies always bring out. They trot it out, that we have to get this balance between privacy and security. I would suggest this is a false dichotomy. We need that privacy in order to have that security, that we will not be predated on by potentially hostile powers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to open the question and answer session to Mr. Drake and Ms. Machon. We do the usual routine. So, just to be practical, we are seriously behind schedule now. So I'm already going to, first of all, inform the rapporteur here that we will probably reduce your 10 minutes of drawing conclusions to 1.
I don't want.
Okay, we've just gained 10 minutes.
Right, yeah.
And I'm also already going to mentally prepare the speakers at the next session. That I'm going to ask them to be even more brief than you were already prepared to do, because we're really behind time, and we have to finish at 6:30 because of the interpretation. Mr. Moraes, the rapporteur.
Yeah, I'll spare you from my conclusions. You were all here, but anyway, my question may seem mundane given the intensity of all of these contributions, but one of the big things we have to do in our report finally is to understand what the space is philosophically and practically for whistleblowers, where you sit and where you actually say what you have to say. Now, in the US experience, you have this Presidential Policy Directive 19, which President Obama talked about. Now, I know what you're going to say about this, that it doesn't really provide whistleblowers with anything to say. I know you're going to say that. But you need to explain to us on the record what it means. That gives whistleblowers the internal possibility of saying something according to the US authorities. But if it doesn't, then tell us where a whistleblower in the United States from the NSA who genuinely sees something happening can say it in any sort of safety. If they can't, then what does that say for any whistleblower? Does it mean there is no scope? Is there any legislative scope at all? And then what, in your opinion, does it say for us here in the European Union or in any of the member states? And for the United Kingdom example, I mean, I'm very familiar with the UK, and I would just say that it isn't really much to do with the unwritten constitution, because we have many examples in other member states with written constitutions where we have the same problems of lack of national intelligence scrutiny. But again, for whistleblowers in individual member states, we don't have parliamentary scrutiny in most member states. We've already learned that. So again, for individual EU member states, there is insufficient protection. So in some more detail, what would you see are the protections we should recommend here in the European Parliament, finally in the report?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask all the speakers to really stick to 2 minutes max. You can even be shorter if you want. Mr. Vos for the EPP.
Ich würde gerne wieder auf Deutsch sprechen. German? Yeah.
Okay, he's going to speak German if you have your headset on. Okay.
Oh, wonderful. So, natürlich suchen wir alle immer die richtige Balance zwischen der notwendigen Sicherheit oder auch der erforderlichen Privatsphäre. Und wir sind hier, jedenfalls nach meinem Verständnis, auch zu fragen oder herauszufinden, inwieweit überhaupt bei dieser Massendatenüberwachung überhaupt noch rechtsstaatliche Elemente noch vorhanden sind. Deshalb würde ich Sie beide gerne fragen, werden die gesammelten Daten eigentlich zum überwiegenden Teil oder eben überhaupt zum Teil auch dazu benutzt, eben ohne entsprechende Ermächtigung auszuwerten und entsprechend zu verwenden. Und darüber hinausgehend werden diese Daten eben tatsächlich zur Wirtschaftsspionage oder eben auch zur politischen Spionage benutzt und eben nicht nur zur Gefahrenabwehr. Das wäre meine Frage an Sie, ob Sie da Erkenntnisse haben.
Okay, thank you also for being very brief, Mr. Albrecht.
Thank you, first of all, for being here, for bringing us your views. It's very important for us, and I think one thing is very important, and that's the first part of my question, which is the actual scale which you have seen of blanket retention by these intelligence services? I mean, you have been Mr. Drake, with the NSA until 2006, you know what happened until then, and it would be very important for us to know to which extent that happened at that time, and also in the MI5, I think that would be helpful to get an insight of what is actually happening and possible. And the second part of my question would be, you talked about oversight so parliamentary oversight. How do you see that this could be done effectively? That is the big question. We need to answer it, and that's what we want to do here in the European Parliament. So if you have recommendations to that, I would be very happy. And of course on whistleblower protection, but you already said quite a lot. But if you could concretely say something on data protection rules, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Nobody on behalf of the ECR. So then we go to GUE, Mrs. Ernst.
Ja, vielen Dank. Zunächst erst einmal meinen großen Respekt, dass Sie hier sind. Was für ein guter Tag. Auch für uns, glaube ich. Das muss man einfach mal so sagen. Ich habe große Achtung davor. Und 2 Fragen will ich an Sie richten, die mich die ganze Zeit hier umtreiben. Die erste Frage ist, wie ist parlamentarische Kontrolle möglich? Sie haben einiges gesagt, Frau Machon, dass parlamentarische Kontrolle, ein Ausschuss, der unabhängig sein soll, gegründet werden muss. Wie ist das auf europäischer Ebene notwendig und auf nationaler? Was können wir hier wirklich real machen? Und der zweite Punkt ist, der mich natürlich am meisten umtreibt, ja, was muss gesetzlich verankert werden zum Schutz von Whistleblowern? Denn da muss was passieren. Und zwar an welchen Ebenen muss das geschehen? Ich habe ja einiges gelesen von dem, was Sie uns gegeben haben an Empfehlungen. Das ist alles gut, aber vielleicht doch noch mal zu dem Schutz von Whistleblowern. Für uns ist das eine Art Redline für die Diskussion zum Datenschutz. Und ich glaube, hier muss gravierend etwas geschehen. Und ich bitte Sie, da uns einige Hinweise noch mal zu geben.
Thank you, Mrs. Ernst. Then I will ask the last question in this round on behalf of ALDE, a shadow of ALDE. I was rather struck by the expression you used, the war on whistleblowers, which is really, if you listen carefully, the war on democracy. Because if all the oversight mechanisms don't work, if the transparency mechanisms don't work, then basically whistleblowers are the only instrument we have left, if you'll excuse me for using the word instrument to indicate you, to know what's going on. Because, I mean, as unbelievable as it may sound, this all gives the impression of completely runaway secret services, behaving like Dirty Harry and cowboys. The word ethos somehow, sits. And I have two questions. There's still people there are actually people, members of this House, who have called whistleblowers criminals, who should be convicted. Unfortunately, the people who said that aren't present here today. They didn't feel the need to come. But what would you say to those people who say whistleblowers are criminals and these programs are necessary to keep us safe? Are we naive or are they just seriously misguided? My second question is, why do bodies like Congress or indeed the British Parliament or any other national parliament, why do they accept to be led by the nose? Why do they accept that? Why do they accept, I mean, there seems to be a state in the state, but if we pretend that we are a democracy, if we believe that we have the moral authority to lecture the rest of the world, then why is it that parliaments don't function? Why don't they exercise their rights of scrutiny? Why don't they do their duties? That is what I cannot understand. I hope you can answer. Shall I start with Mr. Drake for answering the questions?
In terms of whistleblower protection, I'll defer to the statement and testimony of Jesselyn Raddick that's coming up. I believe she can provide you insight in that regard. The fact remains, in my case, I was completely exposed. Any existing law that existed was a paper tiger, and I had no cause of action or recourse in the court system. And there's a lot more to say on that, but I'll defer to Ms. Raddick. The data retention question, rule of law, the issue is actually under U.S. law, going back to the normative understandings foundation of the Fourth Amendment. You must have a probable cause supported by an affidavit, and it doesn't matter what's happened here. Is it in the greatest of secrecy, and now we're starting to see even more of the disclosures of how far that actually went. You can't, basically the government has decided to simply seize and then search later. The threshold is actually at the search point, the particularized search, the particularized place, location, and what are those items you wish to seize. The question about industrial, financial, or other forms of espionage, I believe the disclosures that you are seeing in the press are significant evidence pointing to the use of intelligence or repurposing intelligence based on secret accesses for other reasons. This has been one of the great elephants in the room, is beyond just the claim of having intelligence to quote unquote defeat or protect or to blunt terrorism and other related activities. When you have that kind of information, what else could it be used for? It could also be used, I would add, for political purposes. In terms of the scale, I actually was at NSA until 2008. I was aware of the beginning foundations of the PRISM program. That was basically the attempt by the US government to put what had been disclosed in the previous 2 years back into a much larger Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act box and then secretly interpret it to continue to have access, unfettered access to what they had been doing for the previous 4 or 5 years. NSA, frankly, had unfettered access without any of the intervening Enabling Act legislation, and then secretly reinterpreted Section 215 of the Patriot Act in 2006 under a relevancy clause to gain access to staggering amounts of data, including all phone records from the major telcos. So for me, it's sort of an echo chamber effect. the Snowden disclosures, in fact, are simply evidence of the industrial scale and nature that's become very much normalized, institutionalized. In terms of oversight, I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but quite serious. What we have are undersight committees in the U.S. legislature. They're completely compromised. There's only a few senators and representatives who are willing to stand up. Part of it is another elephant in the room is there's tremendous amounts of money, part of what I blew the whistle on, staggering amounts of money being made by private corporations in league with the government for surveillance. Surveillance, frankly, is a huge growth industry. And you have not just corporations selling data, monetizing data for a profit. They get to do the same thing by selling the subscriber information to the government, and they're not doing so gratis, believe me. War on democracy is extraordinarily critical and insightful way of saying it. That's ultimately what's at stake here, are the very foundations of democracy. Something has to give. And when you have secret laws and secret evidence and secret courts and secret opinions, then democracy itself is imperiled. And history is not kind. The problem is we have extraordinary technology, and I would certainly urge in the strongest possible language that this body seriously consider what is absolutely necessary to protect the sovereignty and integrity of your member nations, but most importantly, the sovereignty of your individual citizens. What you're seeing is the replacement of the rule of law. That is the great equalizer by a pernicious form of authoritarianism. And there is history in this continent alone, having lived here myself for over 6 years, there is history that I think should speak extraordinarily powerfully in terms of what happens when you live inside authoritarian and even fascist states.
Thank you. Ms. Machon.
I shall try and keep these as brief as possible, and perhaps there seem to be a number of similar themes coming out from the questions, so if I can conflate them. First of all, how can we protect whistleblowers or beef up the oversight or draw up laws? What's necessary to protect future whistleblowers, if possible, within the EU? I think certainly the setting up of parliamentary committees, meaningful parliamentary committees with proper legal powers to investigate allegations of crime coming from within the intelligence agencies in all our countries would be a good first step, and they would have to prove themselves and be seen to properly investigate these operations. That would be a good first step. Then we could also try and institute some greater protections for the individual whistleblowers. So, for example, in the UK, there is a law in place called the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998, which is there to protect whistleblowers. So they can't be victimised, they cannot be sacked, etc. Of course, the intelligence agencies are specifically excluded from that, as they are specifically excluded from the Freedom of Information Act we have. Perhaps we should think about including them under some of these sort of legislations. The other thing to bear in mind is that even within the spy agencies themselves, they only reckon that there are 3 types of secrets that really need to be kept secret, and they're logical. Ongoing operations, which, if they're exposed, would blow the operation. Sensitive operational techniques. Well, I mean, that's blown wide open now with the NSA scandal. But in the UK, for example, we still can't use telephone intercept in legal cases because it's supposed to be secret. So that's how ridiculous the law can be. And the third point which needs to be kept secret is agent names. Those who are infiltrating groups on our behalf and risking their lives, of course. But even within the spy agencies, that is what they acknowledge needs to be kept secret. Yeah, if there's an operation 5 years ago and that comes out, so what? But we still, as citizens, need to know fairly relative intelligence operations in order to have an informed perspective when we then go to vote for what sort of parliamentary people we want in there who will control the intelligence agencies. So, in terms of real secrets, perhaps a reform of, in the UK, the Official Secrets Act 1989. Let's put back the public interest defence that was taken out specifically to get whistleblowers. And in fact, most of the people who then went on to become the Labour government voted against the removal of this public interest defence. So I think that also needs to go back in. So That's all at a national level. Just one point on the European parliamentary level. Perhaps if those national oversight bodies fail, there could be a sort of an appeal route or something, that European citizens from any country, intelligence whistleblowers from any country, could then appeal to this body for help in not having to go to prison, in getting investigations into spy crimes investigated. Picking up on the war on democracy as well, I think you are absolutely right. And I think the tensions have been, the intelligence agencies have been well aware of the tensions building between the digital natives, the spread of the internet, the spread of free speech and ideas and knowledge, and their power to control us. So I would call it almost like an arms race, what has been going on with the NSA, certainly, and GCHQ, certainly, over the last 10, 15 years, where they are trying to get more and vaster ways of taking away our privacy, working out what we're thinking and reading and who we're meeting and what our strategies are. So it's an arms race between us. And I think this is a last chance for the European community to make a stand and say, let's not go down this path. Let's not be taken over by these sort of technologies. And we can do that. I know you've heard evidence from other more technologically expert people than I, but we can do this by weaning ourselves off our US internet dependencies, creating the jobs, creating our own infrastructure, creating the educational values that will protect us as citizens within the EU, because as the European Parliament, your first duty is to protect the EU citizens. Just one final thing, picking up on the point about, are we traitors? Well, of course some people say that. I wish those people had been here today, because I would love them to hear this answer. And it's something that's been thrown at me and many other whistleblowers time and again. I signed up, and I signed the Official Secrets Act. I signed up to make a difference. I was motivated to have a job that could potentially save lives, and that motivation is what carried me through into blowing the whistle to potentially save future lives from spy crimes. And I signed the Official Secrets Act to protect official secrets, which is what I have done and what I will continue to do for all the successful operations that I saw or was involved in. However, I did not sign up to protect unofficial secrets and spy crimes. And that's all I and David ever exposed in the public interest. And if we'd been prosecuted under the 1911 Official Secrets Act, we would have had that defence. He wouldn't have had to go to prison. So why on earth are the criminals within the intelligence agencies not the ones on trial? The people who are involved in MI6 funding Al-Qaeda associates in Libya in 1996 were never even questioned by the police. They were certainly not charged with conspiracy to murder. They were certainly not convicted or imprisoned, but the whistleblower was for exposing that crime. And we see something similar, we have seen recently something similar with the Chelsea Manning case, where he exposed primarily the collateral murder video. You remember that, the helicopter gunship? It's like a snuff video game where the soldiers were shooting up children and journalists and innocent people. And he exposed that war crime. And he's the one in prison, not the pilots who gloated with enjoyment as they murdered those children and those journalists and their family. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming and giving evidence and I think that's an endorsement of the work you've done and the courage that you have shown. It's not very, very common that we have applause in this committee, so you can take that as a big, big compliment. Okay, then we're going to move on very quickly to our last session. Sorry, you're absolutely right. We have a question left. I apologize to Mr. Brons. Mrs. Morvai, but Mrs. Morvai is going to be very, very brief because you've had the floor. Mr. Brons first. Sorry, I got mixed up. We're not at the end of the session yet.
Right, Mr. Drake's testimony that 9/11 was the watershed shows that whatever the articulated purpose of the perpetrators of that outrage, the function it's fulfilled is to provide the pretext for surveillance. To what extent did NSA operatives and other agencies have the desire for surveillance before it found the pretext that it wanted? You revealed that action taken against you for revealing NSA activities. Have you witnessed it being used for wider political purposes against enemies of the political class that have causes unconnected with surveillance? Miss Machon, I'd like to ask you how data's used. You mentioned about ministers and I think journalists being under surveillance. Are they threatened with exposure if they act in a way that's disapproved of? Mr. Hague has shown a willingness to cooperate with the security services. Could I ask very cautiously, has he done this willingly? Because some of his activities could be said to make him vulnerable. I'll say no more than that. Do the security services in the UK use information in wider political causes, unconnected with revelations about security? Is there simply a bureaucratic desire to defend the institutional interests of the security services, or does it have a wider political agenda? If so, whose agenda is it? It's all very well to ask what would happen if some bogeymen came to power. I suspect that governments of many, possibly all political persuasions, if they had the temptation, they would take it. Thank you.
Probably true. Mrs. Morify, be as brief as you can, please.
I don't know why exactly do I need to be briefer than anybody else. I mean, there are hardly any members of the committee
you got
here.
The floor for the third time, and I'm just looking at
everybody
the clock,
else had 2 minutes, so let me have 2 minutes too, Madam Chair. So the most obvious question is how can the sun rise every day after your revelations and the revelations of Mr. Snowden? But on a more concrete note, you mentioned, Mr. Drake, the Stasi agents and the work of Stasi collecting data. At this point in time, basically everybody agrees that state socialism or communism was a dictatorship, and that was one of the means of the dictatorship to achieve whatever aim that they had. This is a kind of a politically correct, accepted statement. But is there a dictatorship today? This is a much less politically correct statement or even question that are we talking about a dictatorship today, and who are the dictators? Is it the United States, or is it, I don't know, corporations, multinational companies, bankers, hand in hand with the political power and the 1% having a dictatorship over the 99%? What's going on here? You said that it all started with 9/11, but there was the Elon affair beforehand, so did it really start with 9/11? And the last question, what gave you the two of you the power to go through all this suffering and difficulties in order to save freedom for all of us? Thank you so much, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I invite Mr. Drake first to answer?
I'll start with the last first. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. It was a grand experiment launched over 20 years ago, and it was an idea and how to best govern ourselves back across the Atlantic Ocean. An idea. And similar to Annie Machon, I didn't take an oath to secrecy. I didn't take an oath to illegalities. I didn't take an oath to violating the sovereignty of people. And so it's fundamental to why I stood up. I recognize, and as I've met other colleagues who've done similar crisis of conscience, that was what I chose to do for the future. It wasn't me, it was about others. I could not stand by and see this aversion of the very way of life that I had taken an oath to support and defend 4 times in my government career. And I did so knowing that it was at great risk, particularly in the post-9/11 world. And I stayed as long as I could within the system until I could no longer remain. In terms of the Stasi, I'm really reflecting, you say dictatorship. Yeah, there's powerful interests, both political and corporate. I have referred to it as soft tyranny. The problem is with the kind of technology we have, it doesn't take much for the surveillance state, particularly if you've seen the recent revelations, to find out just about anything there is on just about anybody at any time. I'm going to the other question about NSA. NSA actually came to internet late, and the reason is they didn't think there was anything worth knowing on internet because it was open. The only things worth knowing were those things that were secret, ironically enough. That dramatically changed in the years preceding 9/11, and I'll just briefly say that during the presidential transition team under George Bush in the year 2000, the fall of 2000, NSA actually, and it's out there on the internet, put together a paper that would significantly erode the probable cause standard of the Fourth Amendment. They were already looking for ways, and when 9/11 occurred, it simply became the pretextual justification to expand the surveillance state in a quite significant manner. I think that answers most of the questions that I recall. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Machon.
Well, those are very interesting questions, thank you. And I could actually do a whole new talk on them, but I shall skip quickly through the key points. First of all, are politicians in the UK or media types compelled by the spies to do their bidding because of secret information held on them? They are never allowed to see what's held on them. Even if they are the Home Secretary in charge of MI5 or the Foreign Secretary in charge of MI6 and GCHQ, they are not, even at that time, allowed to see the files held on them. So, for example, Jack Straw, when he was Foreign Secretary or Home Secretary, was not allowed to. So they don't know what the spies know about them. But you can imagine with politicians, some of the little guilty secrets or that affair might come back or something like that. And with journalists, exactly the same thing. Because they don't know, that causes greater fear, potentially, in their minds. And that, I think, particularly is why the former Labour government was so keen to kowtow to the intelligence community and to shred and give them lots of more resources and powers in the noughties. Do they look at wider political causes? Yes, and they have done. And so do the undercover police officers, which sort of inherited this work, political work, from the spies in the 1990s. But I think what is more concerning is how the goalposts are moving within UK law, so that the undercover cops, the police officers, were investigating domestic extremists, even though that is not a category recognised under UK law. And groups which are pure activist groups, such as Occupy in the City of London, were deemed by the City of London police to be domestic extremist/terrorist group. And we all know how terrorists can be treated under the law these days. So the goalposts themselves can move. And if they change the definition of what your activist group is, you become a legitimate target. And that's a real danger in a democracy. Why do they keep holding on to power? It's jobs for the boys, essentially. So when the Cold War ended, what were we going to do? We had MI5 with all this free time on their hands. Let's give them IRA terrorism to work on. Oh, we have the peace process in Northern Ireland. Let's give them Al-Qaeda to work on. Rather than taking a step back and saying, what are the threats to our real national security, our national existential integrity, and how do we best protect ourselves from those threats? And that if MI5 is not up to the job, then get rid of it. Set up a counter-terrorism agency made of the best and the bright from the police and the spooks or whatever, and make sure they work under the conditions that the police have to work under, evidentially and with accountability and oversight. We have MI5 policing terrorist groups in secret with no accountability when they're supposed to be doing a police-type job. Finally, are we living under a dictatorship? I would go back to Mussolini's famous quote about what is fascism, what is the pure definition of fascism? And his view was the merger of the corporate and the state. Now, looking at these mega global corporations, looking at the lobby groups that can and have influenced certain key legislation, even in this august institution, like the ACTA, the Anti-Copyright Trade Agreement last year, which activists heard, most MEPs were not even allowed to read, they were just expected to sign. That is corporations taking over the function of the state. And I think this is just one final comment. This takes us back as well to the valedictory warnings from history of the outgoing President Eisenhower in 1961 in the US, where he warned of the military-industrial complex. I think this has morphed hideously, Hydra-like, into the military security intelligence complex. And security particularly, and war on terror particularly, and intelligence and surveillance particularly, are very good for big business and mega corporations, as Thomas Drake mentioned earlier. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, and I apologize again for the confusion earlier on. That concludes this session. Then we are going to the last session. I'm going to invite the next speakers to join us on the podium. I apologize to you.